We have a new free book for Human Action Podcast listeners, Dr. Guido Holzman's How Inflation Destroys Civilization. Learn how inflation isn't only making us poorer, it's harming our culture, mental well-being, and the moral foundations of civilization itself. Get your free copy today at Mises.org/HAPodFree. While the government tries to hide the consequences of inflation in their official statistics, Americans see and feel it every day. Join the Mises Institute in Tampa on February 17th for our first event of 2024. We'll discuss inflation, its causes, consequences, and cure. Tom DiLorenzo, Joe Salerno, and Patrick Newman will uncover the state's deceit to reveal inflation for what it really is: deliberate debasement of the dollar to create winners and losers. Sign up now at Mises.org/Tampa 2024 and use code ACTION24 for 15% off admission. This is the Human Action Podcast, where we debunk the economic, political, and even cultural myths of the days. Here's your host, Dr. Bob Murphy.
Joe, welcome to the Human Action Podcast.
I'm happy to be here, Bob. Thanks for inviting me.
Sure thing. So you had recently relayed to me a paper that you had written, I guess, was it a talk too, that for the Mises Supporter Summit. So maybe first just explain what the Supporter Summit is and then maybe get into how you chose your topic.
The Mises Supporter Summit is a gathering, a conference held for members and donors of the Mises Institute, as well as the associated academics. So it's a broad audience. And so I wanted to bring to their attention the fact that something that they may have heard and is continuously beamed at us through the media, and that is that there's really only two approaches to monetary policy. One is discretion, and the other is rules. And these opposite positions take place or are held by economists, but they also impinge on how monetary policy is run and which affects the populace at large.
Maybe so, Joe, if I could stop you just for a second, I'll chime in. Because folks, I got my degree from NYU. I was there from 98 to 2003, and what Joe was talking about was definitely orthodoxy at that point. And the program is, even though there was the Austrian Fellowship, as you know, Joe, yes, the standard program I went through was, I guess they'd call it New Keynesian, right? And and the big, Mark Gertler was a huge macro guy there, and some others, heavy hitters in that vein, and yet we were taught matter-of-factly that, oh yeah, so-and-so had, I don't remember what the seminal papers were in this genre, but the idea being that, there's ultimately, at least in the short run, a trade-off between unemployment and inflation, but they did come to realize that, yes, that so-called Phillips curve can move around, and so you couldn't just continually have unemployment be at 1% and inflation not be too bad, that over time, to keep unemployment at 1% if it was below the natural rate, the inflation, by which they mean consumer price inflation, would keep getting higher and higher as people came to expect it and adapt it and blah, blah, blah. And so they said the way you can improve that trade-off is if you pre-commit ahead of time to a bunch of rules. So what ends up happening is if you had a discretionary policy, that means at any given moment, the central bankers get together and they decide, here's what the situation looks like,
right,
by adjusting the levers of how much money we pump into the credit markets and our target, blah, blah, blah. We can achieve this much unemployment, but at the cost of this much inflation we'd have to tolerate. But if ahead of time they commit and say, no, in the moment, if the rule says, if unemployment's like this, then we can do such and such, but if inflation gets above this level, we gotta tighten, sorry, even though it's gonna cause pain.
Right.
If everybody knows that going into it and believes it, then actually that trade-off, the alleged trade-off between inflation and unemployment, is better than it otherwise would have been, and hence they gain the benefits of pre-commitment. And that's why they say central bankers after the early 80s experience, like they wanted to inculcate in the public this reputation of toughness. Like, oh, those central bankers, they don't care about the unemployed. They want to protect the currency, and that actually was good for the workers.
Yeah, that was the word. They used the word credibility. They wanted to establish credibility, and that this rule is a credible rule. They're not going to depart from it because of high rates of unemployment, and that. I mean, that's the argument for having a rule, that it makes as you said, it makes the trade-off better.
Okay, so with that context, then now you're weighing in on this familiar trope, I guess.
Yeah. So what I thought about was that ideology doesn't play any part in this whatsoever. The ideas that people hold about how against or for inflation. So when I looked around for some recent episode in which discretion actually was practiced, but in a way that was anti-inflationary. So I found that during the Eisenhower administration, we had very, very good performance, both with inflation and unemployment and growth to some extent. And that, looking back from our perspective now, that was one of the best periods as far as macroeconomic results are concerned in the U.S. And I looked at a number of different economic historians, McClanahan and Becker, who are sort of revisionists, who were more or less conservative historians, and they lauded Eisenhower. Even middle-of-the-road historians, sort of monetarists, thought he did a good job, as well as even a left-wing historian, Anthony Campagna. So I went and I looked a little bit more closely at what Eisenhower had done. And it's interesting, the Republican Party had been extremely ideological coming into the 1950s. The old right still had its hand in the party. It still had weight and influence. So you had Robert Taft. Now, he did lose the nomination to Eisenhower. Some people would even claim it was stolen from him. And
elections are not stolen, and neither are nominations, Joe. Come on. Not in this country.
Yeah, I'm sorry for the heresy there. But but Eisenhower was a proponent of what was called modern republicanism, which was moderate New Deal. He wasn't going to repeal the New Deal, and he was going to actively fight against any catastrophic depression. But yet Eisenhower still held an extreme anti-inflationist ideology, which came from the old right. And he was also very pro not only balanced budget, but running surpluses and paying off the debt. And he campaigned on that. Evidently, during the 1940s, he was very, very impressed about how bad inflation can hurt both the economy and just regular citizens, and also undermine government programs to some extent. So was this just campaign rhetoric? And looking a little deeper, I saw that, in fact, it was not. I mean, he stood behind what he said. He appointed, and you could see this in two ways. One way was the advisors and policymakers he chose. So he appointed Arthur Burns, the head of the Council for Economic Advisors, in his first term. And at that time, even though Burns went on to become the most inflationary Fed chairman of the 20th century, Burns was extremely anti-inflationary and anti-Keynesianism, and very vocally so. And so Burns wrote a book after a few years after he left the administration after the first term. And in that book, he laid out his views and reflected what he had done in Eisenhower's first term. But he was against any sort of creeping inflation, even a 1% increase. He showed that a 1% increase would cut the value of the monetary unit by 20 to 30% in 25 years. And so.
Can I just stop you for 1 second?
Sure, go ahead.
Is a real quick observation on that.
No, go ahead.
I can't believe that they, by which I mean, I guess the Keynesians, have gotten away with defining price stability to mean prices only go up 2% a year.
Yeah.
Like that's where we are right now, where that's like the definition of stable prices means the dollar only against consumer goods only loses 2% a year, give or take. And then even they've refined it too and say, oh, what we mean is the personal consumption expenditures on non-volatile, essential core items, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And so, excluding food and gas and things like that. But anyway, so I'm glad you said that no, like when people talk about like the Excel and all that and the natural rate, like
yeah.
In his framework to say what interest rate is consistent with stable prices, I would chime in and say, no, he actually meant stable prices. He didn't mean a predictable rate of decline in purchasing power.
Right. That all came about under Greenspan in the early 2000s when they were talking about when Greenspan sort of fanned the flames of deflation phobia. That he just came out one day with a speech. Actually, it was Bernanke who was the assistant chairman of the Fed before that. Rather, the vice chair. I think Bernanke was the vice chairman, but he was on the board of governors. But Bernanke gave a speech in I think it was November 2002, in which he brought up this idea that deflation was devastating, and that to prevent deflation, there had to be a positive rate of inflation. And then Greenspan, a few months later, gave this famous talk in January to a bunch of businessmen. And in which he pushed this whole idea that we have to have a sort of a positive rate of inflation.
Okay, so sorry, I interrupted you. You were telling the story. Burns was committed to, saying even 1% inflation in the long run. Look at what that does to the dollar's strength and so forth.
And so Burns resigned to go back to academia in after the first term, and excuse me. Raymond Saunier was then appointed as the chair of the CEA, and he was a very interesting guy. He was an economist who wrote a book in the 1930s on business cycle theory. It was very, very probing, very wide-ranging, and he covered a lot of business cycle theorists, including Hayek and Keynes. And he was very conservative and very, very anti-inflationary. He said that inflation can never be a policy of government, that any inflation undermines the credibility of the government. And so he was really pushing for surpluses, because he said the government has to indicate through its actions, not just through some verbiage, that it was committed to anti-inflation. And the way to do that was to consistently run surpluses and pay down the national debt, which fit perfectly with what Eisenhower was saying during his campaign. And Eisenhower did run a few years of surpluses. And in his second term, Eisenhower became much more anti-inflationary. He began to cut the Pentagon budget. He cut in half the number of nuclear aircraft carriers that the Navy was building. He reduced forced the Pentagon to reduce the amount of missiles they were ordering, and so forth. And not only that, he also reappointed twice William McChesney Martin, who was as the chairman of the Fed. And at that time, for the first 10 years, even though he was originally appointed by Truman, Martin was very, very anti-inflation. Okay, later on under Kennedy and Johnson, he became more inflationary, but very anti-inflation. He was a Wall Street guy. He believed that even slight inflation brings about asset bubbles, because he had seen that on Wall Street. And so the appointments by Eisenhower showed were ideologically driven. They weren't driven by public choice reasons, by Eisenhower wanting to expand his own power or to put Republicans in certain positions. He wanted certain Republicans. He wanted those Republicans who shared his vision of inflation and the ability to rein in inflation. He wanted them to have that sort of inclination and capability. And there was also three recessions under Eisenhower. And this is the second instance in which you can see his ideology coming through. And in his second term, there were two. And he was, during those two recessions, Eisenhower stood firmly against any countercyclical policy. And in fact, during the depth of the second recession, 59 and 60, he says, I don't believe for one moment that the public works that have been suggested, and they were suggested by his own CEA at that point. He said, I don't believe for one moment that will do any good in curing the recession, the public works. So this was an example or an episode in which ideology trumped the public choice trap, meaning that people act on, as Rothbard points out in a number of his articles, people act on more than just their narrow self-interest as measured by monetary gain or the accumulation of power. They act for ideological reasons, and this includes politicians. And I had not read or hadn't remembered that I read a few Rothbard articles on the 19th century political parties, which were highly ideological, and it was rooted in the conflicting religions and cultures in the U.S. And so my point, I guess, is that the Republican Party was probably the last gasp of ideological difference between the Democrats and the Republicans in the post-war world. This conflict over ideology. Of course, the Keynesians won when Kennedy took over. The new economics came in, and the Republicans sort of conceded their anti-inflationist position and took up sort of the Keynesian cudgels, but not being as radical in their belief that there was a Phillips curve, that was a menu of choices which allowed the Fed and other policymakers to trade off unemployment against inflation.
Well, yeah, folks, if you're watching the video version of this, we'll flash up a graphic, but I'm just looking. So Eisenhower was in office from 53 through 61. And just to give folks an idea, so the year-over-year increase in the consumer price index, it peaked in early 51. It looks like about 9.6% or so. So that obviously the seeds of that had been sown before he came into office. And then it went all the way down, and actually in early 1955 was negative, like negative 0.6, meaning, year over year prices had fallen. Right. And then it popped back up again, but it only maxed out at like 3.5 or 3.6%. And then it's just low. And then after Eisenhower's out of office, like you say, Joe, there's just this upward trend with each successive peak being higher than the prior one, culminating right at the 1979, 1980, where it got really out of hand, up at like 14.6% at the peak year over year. So again, just showing, of course, it's not that literally Eisenhower went into the Federal Reserve every day and said how many $100 bills were they printing, but certainly you can see coinciding with his administration, because during World War II there were, of course, once the price controls were lifted and it was legally allowed to reflect what was going on in reality, there were huge bursts of consumer price inflation. And then, under Eisenhower, those kind of got tamped out of the system. And then once he left, they started slowly creeping back in.
Yeah, one interesting point, I bring this up in my article. In 1950, Ludwig von Mises wrote an article in which he criticized very severely the Truman administration. He just said the administration. He didn't use Truman's name, but he was obviously referring to Truman as institutionalizing huge deficits and the financing of those deficits by massive increases in the money supply. And then in 1958, he wrote an article in which he said that the administration had long ago put aside or moved away from that approach to monetary and fiscal policy. They abandoned the inflationism that had been holding sway in the early 50s. So even Mises recognized this and praised. He mentioned the Federal Reserve and the administration as being the parties to this anti-inflationist movement.
Yeah, and it's so like, I guess one big takeaway what you're saying, like the connection of ideology, just to make sure people aren't getting lost within the details, is that in the standard Keynesian framework, it's more like here's the choices. We're like technocrats, whereas you're actually stressing the ideological factor. Is that a fair way of putting it?
Yes. In fact, Mises says that that's really the only factors that's the only factor involved, that it's you're either an anti-inflationist or you're a pro-inflationist, and pro-inflationism is an ideology. The Keynesianism, the Keynesian doctrine that camouflages this is just that. It's camouflage. The theory is just there to support the pre-existing ideology of inflationism, which existed in the 19th century and before Keynes wrote, certainly in 1936.
Mm-hmm. That's something, I think what you said earlier in this episode or interview, Joe, dovetails with this, but let me just make sure I'm not assuming. Because I remember when I first encountered public choice theory as an undergrad, I recoiled from it. I even went up to Richard Ebling, who was teaching the class on it. I mean, it was a broader, it was a comparative systems or something. I don't remember exactly what it was, but that was like the topic of that week or something. And I was complaining about it, and I thought it was too devoid of, I guess, ideology, like you say. That I said, no, the reason the public supports protectionism is because they think it's actually good for the country. They're wrong. But in other words, and I said, because otherwise, like if it was just purely a matter of, concentrated benefits, dispersed costs, like you'd see the redheads would have some, subsidy program for redheads that's paid for by non-redheads or something. And you don't see that because you couldn't convince the public that makes any sense. But instead you can do I got to protect auto workers. And so that's why you can have tariffs on Japanese cars and things, even though like the underlying logic is to say, but like, why is it that some inefficient programs work and others don't? It's because the public has been sold this is good for the country. And like I thought that at least some versions of the public choice analysis were just like overlooking that as, that's an irrelevant detail. What's really driving, it's almost like the Marxist, how they say it's the underlying, fundamentals that drive things, and then the ideology just gets added.
Productive forces, right?
Yeah, whereas Mises
the ideology is a superstructure. But Mises would say, Rothbard certainly would say the same thing, that the ideology is a superstructure, but what's driving it is power. The ideology of power versus the ideology of liberty. Mm-hmm. And Rothbard also points out that if you really took public choice theory seriously, rational ignorance would prevent everyone from voting. Why should anybody vote if they know their vote doesn't count? And so, that in itself is sort of a performative contradiction in public choice. You have to have ideology drives people to vote. The pure pleasure of pushing that button against whoever you hate, whether it's Trump or Hillary Clinton, that's driven by ideas. That's a system of ideology. Now, there might be contradictions in the average person's systems of ideology and in many people's ideology, but it is ideas that drive it. And certainly the pursuit of monetary gain is one of the goals that people are aiming at. But there are other goals beyond that, and those goals are emerge from one's worldview or ideology.
It's funny you say that, Joe, because I remember it was actually at NYU, one of the early seminars. I don't remember if it was the Austrian colloquium. I think it was, actually. Maybe you even saw the talk, but some guy came and gave a talk saying how, there's like a fundamental problem in public choice theory, that it's got a bunch of results that are great, like the median voter theorem and stuff like, why is it during the primaries the candidates are real radical, and then when they go into the general election, all of a sudden they're different guys or gals, and you can explain that, and that's a pretty good explanation. Okay, they're appealing to the median. If they go too far one way, then they lose other people who stay home or switch sides. Okay, fair enough. And that's why in the general election, they're two sides of the same coin, because what gain is there to be more radical, that sort of thing. But fundamentally, like you say, the framework they use to explain that type of stuff, like its greatest hits, if you applied it to the individual voter and said, no, it's all a matter of cost, benefit, and rationality, and economic logic applied to politics, then why does anyone bother to go vote? Because the chance of my vote mattering in my state for the Electoral College. And then that's not enough. It's not just that your state has to come down to a margin of 1 so that you voting makes the difference between which way your electoral votes go. But the candidates, the margin of, the winning candidate versus the loser has to be small enough that your state was also decisive. Otherwise, it wouldn't matter. And, so like the chance of your vote, there's a better chance of you dying driving to the polls. And the way and the speaker, the guy coming and giving the paper was just like going through how the public choice theorists kind of just ignored that. Like, well, okay, yeah, that's an issue. But what we're saying is that it was like, that's kind of a big deal if like the whole underpinning of your theory doesn't really explain what's necessary to make this whole system go.
Rothbard points out that the liberal Michael Kinsey, the liberal journalist, when Buchanan won the Nobel Prize for obviously his contribution to public choice, Kinsey did a public choice analysis of all of that and said why, he applied it to Buchanan and his research program, to the Swedish Nobel Committee. Why is it not applicable to everyone, including the public choicers?
That's very clever. Yeah,
the public choicers themselves. And I think Jenny Roback, who was an economist at GMU and a student of Buchanan's, shot back or wrote a letter to the periodical that Kinsey published his article in and said, well, she said this is very nasty. But I mean, it doesn't mean it's not true though. And so yeah, the whole rule versus discretion, the idea of rules goes back to Henry Simons, who was an early Chicago economist, was Milton Friedman's mentor in monetary economics, and he is also James Buchanan, the founder of public choice, took his inspiration from Simons, who talked about having monetary rules. And so the whole public choice movement comes, and the rules themselves are sort of emanations of public choice.
Mm-hmm. Well, what's interesting too, so I don't know if let me try to at least get across my perspective and then see if you understand what I'm saying, Joe. What's interesting is there is a sense in which, to the extent that those alleged trade, like in other words, there's nothing like intrinsically crazy about what they're saying, that, oh yeah, right, if the public genuinely believed it was just off the table that the Fed is not going to ever tolerate 12% inflation, if that's what's necessary in the short run to get inflation, right, unemployment down, then it won't be necessary to have that much. You know what I mean? So that's the interesting thing. It's sort of like saying by making this credible threat that, oh no, we're tough guys and we don't care what happens to unemployment, we're going to make sure the dollar's protected, then the market doesn't call your bluff, as it were, if they really believe. And so if that's the view, well then what's a better commitment than to say ideologically, like, no, that's theft. That would be stealing purchasing power from the people, that you're not allowed to do that. Or like the Fed, of course gold is money. Like, what do you mean fiat money? That's an abomination. That kind of a monetary policy regime, you would have, definite rules. That would definitely be rules-based policy. If you say, no, we're not allowed to do that because it would be immoral and a crime, that's certainly a stronger commitment than just, oh yes, so-and-so published this DSGE model in the AER in 2007 and look at the regression analysis and we had 3 stars in this table. Like, who cares about that? Whereas if it's like, no, this is a moral, legal issue, that seems like a stronger commitment. So it's almost like with would you rather live next door to someone who's a utilitarian and says, oh, it's on the table that I might, eat you tomorrow. I just choose not to because in the long run, I get more utility from not, eating my neighbor because I might get caught. Right. As opposed to someone who's just like, oh, no, I couldn't do that. That'd be disgusting. And I would feel horrible because I have a conscience. It's right. So that sort of, anyway, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a great point, Bob. And that's, I guess, the takeaway from my article, that if you believe that, as Eisenhower voiced on a number of occasions, that inflation is theft, that's it's stealing from certain groups in the population. And if you go back to the 19th century, I mean, that was the view of Thomas Jefferson and Jackson. President Andrew Jackson, and that's how they respectively, brought down the two banks of the U.S., which were the first quasi-central banks in U.S. history. They're privileged banks, and they were inflationary. So I completely agree that having sort of an ideological reason that's strongly held operates with the credibility of a rule. I mean, it shows a commitment, and of course commitment was followed through with Jackson bringing down the bank and then instituting sort of his pet banks, in which only gold was held by the federal government in those banks.
Yeah, something I didn't know about Jackson until I was older is that, like, the way I think I even wrote a term paper in high school. Yeah, it was high school, in my American history class or something, criticizing him. Like I thought he was anti-commerce. I thought he was like some rube who just didn't understand modern industrialization or finance or something. And look, he's against banking and New York's scary. But no, I mean, of course, from more my modern vantage point, as you can imagine, Joe, I realized no. What he was saying is he was against inflation and dishonest bankers, sort of living off of the produce of the farmers.
Right.
He would do stuff like a campaign stops, for those who don't know, like hold up gold coins and say, "This is genuine money," not that paper that the people in New York push around. Words of that effect. But what I didn't realize, so not only did he kill the second bank in the United States, but he literally paid off the federal debt. And for people at home, I don't just mean he balanced the budget and ran a surplus. I mean, he literally paid off the debt. So that's kind of, just showing that, those two things tend to go hand in hand.
Yes.
That, that commitment to a strong currency and an aversion to debt.
That's a very interesting point. In his second term, I mean, there's a parallel with Eisenhower. Eisenhower wanted to pay down the debt. I mean, continually pay down debt, run surpluses every year, regardless of whether we had a recession or not. And he, to some extent, he succeeded, but overall he did not. But the point again was that this was held very strongly as an ideology by Eisenhower. And he even was willing to sacrifice another part of his ideological program, his so-called modern republicanism, because he wanted small increases in education, in highway construction, and so on. And he said that because he held because economic historians point out, but because he held the anti-inflationist ideology so strongly, he realized that would impinge on the budget. It would make it less likely for him to run surpluses. So he abandoned his so-called modern Republican movement, which was sort of an anti-old right, anti-Taft movement. So I think that. So the takeaway in all this is to supercharge American politics with ideology again. To have very ideological parties. Now that's beginning to happen with the Republican Party. Unfortunately, it's not happening on economic matters as much as it is with social issues. Mm-hmm. But I think it's a step in the right direction.
I hesitate to ask this next question, Joe, because I just know how our critics are going to frame it. But you know what? They're going to say bad stuff about us anyway. So why don't we just? Is it a coincidence that the two presidents we've been highlighting were both, celebrated military generals?
I don't know, but
like I said, this will now be excerpted to say, Mises Institute scholars favor, military juntas. Yeah. But anyway, if just, I guess one explanation could be, they're strong, take charge men, and that's why they can come into a situation and not be cowed by the academics telling them, oh no, that would lead to disaster. Like they've learned to identify who's giving me good counsel and who's not, because you have to know that out in the battlefield, or otherwise you're dead.
Right. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. You also, I mean, this is also going to draw criticism from our critics, and that is, Trump seemed to be a very strong president. I mean, he made a lot of strategic errors in carrying out his program, and I think he was confused, and he did a lot of bad things economically. But I think Trump, I think you need someone who is ideological, or at least sounds ideological, and can reach the masses with let's call it a fierce ideology. I mean, I think that's what has to happen. The ideology has to be held very fiercely.
Yeah, I mean, the obvious example staring us in the face is Javier Milei in Argentina. You know, that's whatever one wants to say about him, and whether you think he's really a plant from the WEF, although people have not said that as much as given the talk he just gave to them. But still, yeah, clearly he did not run on a very moderate tiptoeing around. And, well, you know, I've consulted the economic literature, and it looks like this regression says that, you know, we can increase GDP growth by 2 points. That's not what he was saying. You know, he had pretty fiery, bombastic language to come in and, you know, say, "Give me a shot. I can turn this franchise around."
Yeah, so he interspersed his economic program with ideology. I mean, I think that was good. I mean, that strengthens the program, and it strengthens the appeal of the program to the voters.
Yeah, that it dovetails. What you're saying dovetails. I recently, Joe, went over to. It was called the ARC. What does that stand for? The Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, I think is what that acronym is. It's Jordan Peterson and friends tried to establish like this rival entity that, you know, would sort of give the free society version of what the WEF is doing. Like, maybe that's not the way they'd put it, but that's one element of what it was. And something a lot of the speakers kept stressing is how the collectivists have a better story they've been telling people. You know what I mean? Like, they're telling young people, like, why is it that just Hollywood is so easily anti-capitalist and the entrepreneur is always the bad guy? And you know, and it's partly they were saying because they just are good at telling a better story, whereas the right tends to, you know, at least historically has tended to just say, well, yeah, but we have better facts. And what do you, no, but if the other side feels like they're swept up in this grand narrative of justice and helping the downtrodden, you coming along, you know, with some statistics, that's, you know, you're fighting fire with something else.
Yeah, I agree. I think the Democratic Party recognized much earlier than the Republican Party that there's nothing wrong with being highly ideological and taking extreme positions, and I think that helped them. But it also opened the door to the Republican Party becoming extremely ideological, and that ideology being something that I think is deeply ingrained in the American psyches. And the ideology of individualism and of the importance of the family unit. I think the Republicans are on the cusp of if they play their cards right, of creating a mass ideological movement. And I think Trump isn't consistently ideological at all, of course, and so he's not the person to do that. But he's ideological enough that he's, you know, appealing to this sentiment.
Yeah. If we had like a candidate who was start with Trump and then have him read a bunch of books, then that's the guy.
That's the guy.
So, sure, why don't we just offend everybody? Let's go for it. What about, it sounds like what you're saying connects with at least one essay that I know Rothbard wrote about, you know, hating the state. And the idea was Rothbard, I don't want to put words in his mouth, so let me just say this, and then you respond if you think that I got what Rothbard's position was correct. That Rothbard respected and admired somebody like a Frederick Bastiat or a Thomas Paine more than, let's say, a David Friedman, even though on paper Friedman is an anarcho-capitalist and those other guys were, you know, call them minarchist or classical liberals, whatever label you want to use. And so one might have originally supposed Rothbard would like Friedman's work more than those earlier guys, but that's not the case because, you know, they were burning with passion for liberty, whereas in Friedman's analysis, it was more like, well, all things considered, it looks like the most efficient outcome is to do this, and you know, as opposed to this is a you know, moral injustice and abomination if the state were to impose rent control. So maybe I'm being a bit bombastic, but do you want to respond to that sort of dichotomy?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think Rothbard liked the guys, even if they were just minarchists, that had a visceral hatred of the state. I mean, you know, he wrote "Do You Hate the State" was the title of that article that you're referring to. Whereas David Friedman is a utilitarian and a public choicer, and a cost-benefit analyst who thinks that, on balance, the benefits exceed the costs of having an anarcho-capitalist society. So yeah, Rothbard. I think that all ties into Rothbard's strategy, which is to have someone who can short circuit the elites with their message, and that's why he liked McCarthy for that reason. He didn't like his ends. He thought McCarthy was just a Cold War guy who went too far, according to the establishment, in his anti-communism. But Rothbard turned that on his head and said that he loved his means of directly appeal, but he didn't like his ends. His ends were to fight the Cold War on all fronts, including the domestic front. And Rothbard thought the Cold War was just, basically started by the U.S. trying to contain, quote unquote, the Soviet Union. But he liked what McCarthy did with a very small group of advisors, and using TV for the first time in a way that had not been used before. So he liked his method, his strategy, the means he used, but rejected McCarthy's ends. And I can't repeat that enough. Rothbard, because McCarthy was sort of a moderate Republican.
Mm-hmm. Just maybe in the last 5 or so minutes that we got here, Joe, can you comment, and I think this dovetails with the broader themes of what we've been discussing, can you maybe talk about modern monetary theory, MMT, and perhaps, I know you've written like on the greenbacker movement, and they're not literally the same thing, but there's a lot of overlap, and just it seems like there's this growing chorus of people. It dovetails too with what you're saying, like this alleged independence of the central bank from the federal government, and say from the MMT camp, like they're just viewing it as the same accounting. It's just like one division of the same corporation doing something else. And that, that's in their mind, taxation. It's certainly not that the government needs to tax in order to raise revenue. They have a printing press. And I've just seen them appealing to more and more people. And I think we're getting close to the point at which the public's just going to say, yeah, if the government wants to pay for something, just run the printing press. And if prices rise too much, then maybe they'll have to back off. But otherwise, let's just see what happens.
There's some interesting observations I can make on that. In the 1960s, there were hearings held in Congress, and they brought in some pretty famous economists, and it was on the independence of the Fed. And both Friedman and Harry Johnson, who was a quasi-monetarist and a very famous monetary economist, both said that this is anti-democratic, having an independent central bank. And Friedman, for a long time, simply wanted to collapse the Fed into a computer in the Treasury that would spit out the change in the quantity of money. So that's the first thing. The other thing is that it's better to look. The Fed is political. The Fed does knuckle under to pressure from the various administrations. Let's make it pellucidly clear. Let's show that, in fact, it's the politicians that are causing inflation with their spending. And so the way to do that is to just get rid of the central bank and allow the Treasury to simply print the money that if the government's going to run a deficit that it wants to finance by money printing, instead of the circuitous way of doing it through a Federal Reserve System that goes through the credit markets and causes the business cycle, just have the Treasury print up the money and spend it on those goods and resources that the government wants to seize directly. In fact, I remember Friedman writing that he'd rather have a deficit of $400 billion financed by the printing of money than a balanced budget at $800 billion, at twice the. And Rothbard has made similar statements that there's really no difference between. It's really spending that is the tax, and that he'd rather cut taxes and have a bigger deficit than to raise taxes to close the deficit. Mm-hmm. Because if you cut taxes, then the natural thing is people abhor deficits. There's a reason for cutting spending. So I'm not against. I certainly would think it's a superior way of printing money, to have it done openly by the Treasury, so that we can see that this is the result of government spending programs, and that the way to stop inflation is to cut spending.
Okay, so let me just repeat that back. So your point, I take it, Joe, is you're saying right now the Fed really is monetizing deficits. And I was pointing this out like during the QE programs. It was like, oh, that seems like a coincidence that right when the Obama administration has 4 years in a row of $1 trillion deficits plus, the Fed says, you know what, we've just independently come to the conclusion it's time for some QE, you know? What a coincidence. And so your point is, rather than going through this shell game where it's not as clear what's going, where technically the Fed's not allowed to directly buy government issued debt, the private market needs to buy it, lend the money to Uncle Sam first, but then the Fed is sitting right there in the wings to absorb it from, the primary dealers or whatever. So it's basically the same thing. Just do it all openly, and that way it's crystal clear. If price inflation gets high and the public saying what's going on is because of unions or greedy corporations, that might be easier for everyone to say, no, it's because the government decided to, spend money on that new fighter jet. That's partly why eggs cost so much now.
And you can throw that, and there's a direct link between the voters and those who are the inflators. You can throw them out of office. Mm-hmm. Again, and this ties into having a very ideological view of inflation, that it's theft, and that should active or get people more active, stir up their dislike for those who are running the inflationary printing presses.
Okay, well, good. Yeah, so I think we've covered all the bases in this episode, Joe, that we praised military dictatorships and said the MMTers are right. That's the way people can, if they want to do a hit piece on us, they can try to summarize what we said. Now, joking aside, thank you. My guest this week, folks, has been Joe Salerno. Among other hats, he's the academic vice president of the Mises Institute. Joe, thanks so much for all the work you do and your time with us today.
Thank you, Bob. It was my pleasure.
And thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We'll catch you next time.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. In the meantime, you can find more content like this on Mises.org.